welcome to this lecture on Chapter 2, The Search for Truth. This is Part 1, the introduction, and a discussion of realism. And once again, I've included a citation, so I'm taking the contents of this lecture from the Arneson textbook, History of Modern Arts, and I'm letting you know that because it's important in an academic context that I cite my source. So I'm letting you know if you want to find where this came from, which I hope you do because you'll need to study that. You can find it in this citation. Let's get started. All right, so we are at the beginning of the 19th century. And for this discussion of realism, we are mostly focused on France. At the start of the 19th century, so in the 1800s, both the neoclassical and romantic styles were popular. Neoclassicism offered viewers glimpses of an imaginary antique past or an exotic otherworldly present rendered in crisp, detached linearity. And we looked at the work of the painter Ingres as an example of this. Romanticism, likewise, tended towards subjects drawn from distant cultures or literary fantasies, but depicted with an undisguised subjectivity and passionate colorism. So again, for example, you could look at the painting of Delacroix. Each of these styles offered its brand of escapism to Europeans who were tired of revolution and wary of the incipient imperialism emerging throughout the West. So a lot of colonialism going on. As European and North American economies grew increasingly reliant on manufacturing, many Western countries seized territory in Africa, South America, Asia, and the Pacific in search of both raw materials and new markets for their goods. Romantic depictions of colonized lands and peoples offered an appealing alternative to the reality of military occupation and economic exploitation sustaining the rise of capitalism. So these styles of painting, neoclassicism and romanticism, offered kind of an escape from the reality of what was happening as these European countries went out and colonized other lands and other people, pillaged the natural resources, and so it's a very different view in art than the reality of what was happening. All right, realism. Dispelling this escapism was an emphatic return to Enlightenment rationality in the form of realism. The challenges imposed by industrial expansion and political upheaval were not to be mastered by a retreat into fantasy, but by a renewed search for truth. So some people rejected this kind of fantastical world of neoclassicism and romanticism and were looking for something that was more true to their own experience. The truth promised by objective analysis and cold reason appealed to artists and writers as much as to philosophers and scientists. That positivism, a philosophy that rejects metaphysical considerations in favor of a strictly empirical approach to understanding all forms of human experience, should gain adherence as a popular as well as intellectual movement, gives an indication of this widespread craving for certainty, whether scientific, moral, economic, or political. In other words, people wanted to be able to rely on a certain concrete idea of truth. And they wanted to see concrete proof, visual facts of the truths they believed in. Realism was the cultural response to this need. New ways of seeing, photography and its influence. The public taste for visual facts served as an important stimulant to the research that finally brought about the invention of the first practical photographic processes. People wanted to see visual proof of the facts they read about and were told. And what better way to present someone with visible proof but with a photograph? In August 1939, Jacques-Louis Mandé Daguerre um, publicly demonstrated what would become one of the first widely available photographic processes, and this is the daguerreotype. The word photography means drawing with light. Different photographic processes were quickly invented after Daguerre announced his process and became commercially available to the middle and upper class audience who was eager to purchase portraits and other types of photographs. Photography influences painting, and painting influences photography. The introduction of photography and its quick commercial spread meant that Western painters became influenced by this new media that they saw all around them in society. The most immediate and obvious impact of photography on painting can be seen in the works of artists who wanted to imitate the ways that photography records the three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional plane, or optical veracity, optical truth. We can see references to the way photography records the world with a type of instantaneity in many realist and impressionist artworks. Different artists reacted differently to the influence of photography. Some painters imitated the way that photography recorded the world. Others saw photography as taking over the job of painters to exactly or faithfully record the world. So now here's this process that can exactly record the world, and so that kind of freed up the painters to pursue other things. They felt they were freed from having to provide a window on the world with their paintings. Instead, they could now work more imaginatively or conceptually, and they moved away from realism. Other artists, however, or even the same ones, took the scrupulous fidelity of the photographic image as good reason to work imaginatively or conceptually, and thus freed their art from the requirements of pictorial verisimilitude, so the appearance of being true or real. And so we can see the move toward Impressionism and Expressionism as these painters kind of felt they were freed from that, their job to provide this window on the world. How does photography influence painting? Still other painters saw the aberrations and irregularities peculiar to photography as a source of fresh ideas for creating a whole new language of form. So we're going to see painters start to cut things off, the way the camera will cut, impose this rectangle on the world and crop on the edges. And we're going to see a motion, right? If someone moves during a photograph, you'll get motion blur. We're going to see painters start to use that. Look at the work of Degas for that. Among the painters of the period were some accomplished photographers, so Edgar Degas and Thomas Eakins. Photography could also serve painters as a visual substitute for closely observed preparatory drawings. They started to use photographs as in the place of having to do all these preparatory sketches, right? You could just use a photograph. Photography provided a huge variety of reliable images drawn from all over the world. Painters could rely on adventuresome photographers to lug their cumbersome equipment, these large wooden cameras, the glass plates and glass bottles of chemicals, to exotic spots all over the world and bring back their photographs, and then artists could sketch from the photographs, and they knew that they had something that was, true, actual. But our early photographs considered artworks. Despite the widespread interest in photography by artists, the aesthetic status of photographs remained suspect. Were photographs considered artworks since they were produced by a machine, the camera, rather than by the hand of the artist, like a painting, a drawing, or a sculpture? Photographs were not generally included in art exhibitions. For instance, at the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1855, photographs were absent from the fine art galleries and instead presented in the industrial halls, highlighting their technical rather than aesthetic interest. And I always say this, you guys know I'm old, but when I was an undergraduate and even in graduate school, there was still talk of whether photographs were actually artworks. So now I think we accept them as such, but this is fairly recent that that we consider photographs to be artworks rather than something else more technical. Regardless of the contested status of photography's aesthetic merit, so in other words, early photographs were not considered legitimate artworks. Early photographers found their works relating closely to painting, just as painters were influenced by photography and compared to photographs. So we can see Daguerre in his early work setting up his photographs as if they were paintings, using objects that reference painting. So it was a very symbiotic exchange between painting and photographs and painting. Photographers were proud of their technical superiority, in other words, their ability to use the cameras and develop their photographs. However, they still felt compelled to match painting in its artistic achievements. For painters, enjoyed the freedom to select, synthesize, and emphasize at will, and thus attain not only the poetry and expression thought essential to art, but also a higher order of visual, if not optical truth. So there was still this idea that because you're setting up the painting, you can set it up any way you want, rather than a photographer who has to point his camera at something in the world, somehow that this made paintings more truthful, more aesthetic, more artistic. So this is in the early days, in the 1800s. All right, only the truth, realism. Photography offered only one avenue for the exploration and documentation of observed reality. Realism was another. Realism developed most fully in France and is tied to the tumultuous political and social history of this period. Following the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, a succession of Bourbon monarchs resumed the governance of France. At first tolerant of moderate reforms, the monarchy grew increasingly authoritarian until another revolution broke out in 1830. A relatively bloodless coup replaced the Bourbons with a king from the Orleans line, and this is Louis Philippe. Corrupt monarchs in France, and this is a way to understand the development of realism in painting. And so thinking about Louis Philippe and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis Philippe called himself a citizen king, and he agreed to govern as a constitutional monarch. A king with a constitution meant he was supposedly giving up some of the power a traditional king would hold. Like the kings before him, Louis Philippe used France's political instability and economic difficulties as a way to take more and more power and authority. At the same time, he limited the rights of the citizens and of the press, so of the journalists. After he was finally toppled in yet another uprising during the Great Revolutionary year of 1848, France's Second Republic was proclaimed. The Republic's president, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, staged his own coup late in 1851, and in 1852 was inaugurated the Second Empire, over which he would rule as extreme head. So we can see that it just goes back and forth between, people uprising and trying to get a more democratic government, and then the head of the government gradually taking more power back to becoming a monarch or, an authoritarian ruler. And this goes back and forth. Reigning as Napoleon III, he lacked the military acumen of his uncle. His disastrous execution of the Franco-Prussian War resulted in the collapse of the Second Empire in 1870. And it's against the backdrop of this torturous journey away from the empire and back again that the development of realism in France must be understood. So this was such a difficult century for, ordinary citizens, and no wonder they wanted to see something that wasn't escapist like neoclassicism and romanticism. They wanted to see something that reflected their experience more. All right, so caricature develops in France. Alongside these historic events, a new kind of journalism and a new kind of critical writing were everywhere evident. Many of the leading authors and critics of France and England wrote regularly for the new popular reviews. This phenomenon is perhaps best seen in the emergence of the caricature. So this is a satirical comment on life and politics, which became a standard feature of journals and newspapers. Although visual attacks on individuals or corrupt economic and political systems have always existed, and artists such as Goya have been motivated by a spirit of passionate invective, drawings that range from gentle amusement to biting satire to vicious attack now became commonplace in every part of Europe and America. So in newspapers, you could buy caricatures very inexpensively, these small prints. These images can be cheaply disseminated through the popular medium of lithography. So you could make many copies of these and sell them cheaply on street corners. These critical images could be sold very cheaply and even distributed for free as a way to get messages of dissent against the government out to the public quickly and inexpensively. You could give these things away at rallies, political rallies. And, how do we do this today? Well, we don't even have to print things today. We use Twitter, Instagram, or maybe, even other other social media outlets. All right, caricature develops in France. We're going to look briefly at the work of Honorary Daumier, who lived from 1808 to 1879. Daumier was an amazing artist. We know him chiefly for his caricatures, his drawings, but he also made these amazing ceramic busts. And he also was an amazing painter, coming from the Romantic tradition, but with a very much of a social justice message. All right, the greatest of the satirical artists to emerge in this new environment was Honorary Daumier, who was best known for some 4,000 lithographic drawings that he contributed to French journals such as La Caricature and Les Chivieries, sorry, again, my French, but was also an important sculptor and painter. His small caricature busts were created between 1830 and 1832 to lampoon the eminent politicians of Louis Philippe's regime, and you can imagine that this did not go over well with Louis Philippe. Daumier's studies of the theater, of the art world, of politics, and the law courts range from simple commentary to perceptive observation to bitter satire. And so Daumier observed the rich, the people in the theater, the art world, and politics, and made these drawings, which were sometimes just kind of, drawings which showed what he saw, but other times exaggerated people's features to make them into caricatures. And he was very interested in social justice. Daumier, his political caricatures were at sometimes so biting in their attacks on the establishment that they were censored. Louis Philippe would have his people go out and get every copy they could find and destroy them. The artist was actually imprisoned for 6 months for a caricature he did of the King Louis Philippe called Gargantua. In 1831, Daumier created a print, so this is a small print that you could buy, or titled Gargantua, depicting Louis Philippe, so this is the King of France, of the French, as a corpulent blob. And he's actually sitting on a toilet, so it's very satirical, it's very biting, with an oversized conveyor belt tongue, consuming money provided by the laborers of France. And Gargantua was also the name of a giant in a series of novels written in the 16th century by Rabelais, and people would have known about these novels. So for this work, Daumier and his publisher, Philippon, were charged, tried, they had to pay a fine, and they were sentenced to 6 months in prison. So this was, this kind of caricature had a great cost for the artist. And here is one of the lithographs, and you can see, so this ginormous blobby King Louis Philippe sits on. Now our toilets don't look like this, but he's sitting on a toilet, and the idea is that all of these people, so these are the poor laborers of France from whom he's collecting these outrageous amounts of taxes, and it's like he's just an unstoppable eating machine, right? All this goes onto a conveyor belt, which is his tongue, which leads into his mouth, and then he's sort of shall we say, pooping out all of this government bureaucracy. So these are all the people that he's keeping in business, his friends and his admirers who are benefiting from all of these taxes. So this is a very biting, anti monarch statement. And so it says a cartoon against King Louis Philippe I, whose financial needs are considerable, and obviously even this is satirical. The king, known for his avarice, his greed, fought hard to obtain an important civil list. He even tried to get some for his large family, so these are all his admirers. After denunciation of the electoral corruption practiced by the regime of the July monarch, in other words, Louis Philippe took over from another monarchy by saying, oh, I'm going to be a much better king. Under the throne, and this is the slang name given to the toilet bowl, we see the deputies bought and again considered as excrement by the government, heading toward the seat of the Palais Bourbon, the seat of the Chamber of Deputies. And so again, you can see how biting his satire was, and how graphic, right? This idea of sitting on the toilet is a pretty graphic way to demean the head ruler of France. There it is, just a little bigger. All right, and so we go from, Daumier is known for these biting satires, which have at their base humor, right? But he also produced a body of work which is very much not humorous, which is a cry for empathy from the viewer, a cry against universal injustice. And these are difficult images of brutality and injustice in the next 3 slides. So when you think of Daumier, remember there's always these two sides, right? There's the satirical side, but then there's also this side where he's very much just observing what happens and conveying that to the viewer in an effort to help us understand the injustice that was going on. And so this is called the Rue Transnonain. And this was an event that happened. So Parisians had lived with political repression enforced by the police and the civil guard for years, and street battles were nothing new, so there was a lot of chaos. The Revolution of 1830, which was inspiration for Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People, had overthrown the repressive monarchy that followed Napoleon's rule. The new ruler, Louis Philippe, called himself the Citizen King, the King of the French, and was supposed to be more liberal. Instead, he clamped down on public dissent and on the press, right? He regulated what the newspapers could print, much like his predecessors. Everybody in Paris knew what happened in this apartment building. It was on the corner of 2 streets, and on the night of April 13th, 1834, soldiers of the Civil Guard entered the building, going from apartment to apartment. So the soldiers said that somebody had fired from the roof of that apartment, which was probably not true. And they used that as an excuse to go in, and they just started killing people. And so workers in the neighborhood had protested. So when lower class workers protested, this was very upsetting to the upper class and to the rulers, and they clamped down as much as they could. And so workers in the neighborhood had protested against the repression of a silk workers revolt in a different city of Lyon, and the soldiers then entered the apartment building in response to supposedly shots fired, and then used that as an excuse to go from apartment to apartment killing people. And so this was an event that everybody knew about. Daumier didn't actually see it, but he created these images. And so here he created a series of lithographs. And again, you can see that these are, there's no humor in these, right? And so it just shows these people were sleeping. The soldiers broke into their apartments, and he very empathetically creates this scene, which sort of stands for all the people that were killed. So if you're looking at a newspaper, you're just going to see this one lithograph. This kind of gives you an idea of the baby who was killed, the father who was killed. These people were sleeping in their beds and they were killed. So it's a very moving image, and it's kind of the flip side of Daumier, when you're thinking about his work. All right, and so the profundity of Daumier's horror at injustice and brutality is perhaps best illustrated in the famous lithograph, Rue Transnonain. which shows the dead bodies of a family of innocent workers murdered by the civil guard during the Republican Revolt of 1834. With journalistic bluntness, the title refers to the street. So he just titles it the street where these killings took place. With its powerful exploitation of the black and white medium, so this is the lithograph, as well as the graphic description of its gruesome subject, this work is comparable to Goya's The Disasters of War. So you remember his series of prints. In the years surrounding the publication of Rue Transnonain, journalists, publishers, and printmakers could face criminal charges, fines, and even imprisonment for their publication. As Daumier had already spent time in prison, he understood the risks he was taking. So as he made this lithograph, he knew that he could go back to jail for doing this. And it stands for its brutal tone and unflinching commentary on what had only recently occurred. Daumier brings together the group of four bodies in one space and extreme areas of light and darkness to give the viewer one image that summed up the violence of that night. He carefully designed the scene so that we feel empathy for the victims. The victims become real people to us with the lighting and the detail of the face of the main figure. Depicting the massacre of innocent civilians, this image is designed to ignite the viewer's moral outrage and indignation. So Daumier wanted people to feel something when they saw this. He wanted them to be outraged. And he designed this image to reflect any injustice experienced anywhere in the world. So it kind of we can think about that, in light of images that we've seen recently depicting injustice in our own world, and it kind of connects back to that, even though it's so long ago, and we see photographs and video, but he's drawing a lithograph, but it's the same kind of image which asks us to react, and it stands for universal injustice. All right, so we're moving from Daumier on to Gustav Corbett, and this is called A Burial at Ornans. It's from 1849 to 50, and I just want you to see the size of this. This is an enormous painting. It is almost 22 feet long. So that's almost 2 stories high. It's very, very large, and it's 10 feet high. So I just want you to have a sense of the impact of this image. Gustav Corbett lived from 1819 to 1877. Like Daumier, Corbett inherited certain traits from his romantic predecessors. He really started out as a romantic painter. He's a complicated figure. He can be very controversial. For feminists, for a lot of reasons. Throughout his life, he produced both erotic subjects that border on academicism and romantic self-portraits. So he's got a lot of facets as an artist. But we're going to focus on his work as the real trailblazer of realism. But most important, he created unsentimental records of contemporary life that secure his place as the leading exponent of modern realism in painting. These works possess a compelling physicality and an authenticity of vision that the artist derived from the observed world. And I just can't emphasize how radical this is. This is such a radical change in art. For us, it doesn't seem that way as we look back, but at the time, it was so incendiary. He was such an important figure. And most notably, Corbett insisted upon the very material with which painting is constructed, oil paint. So he's painting these, not like Daumier, who's doing lithographs. Nothing wrong with lithographs. They're a way to disseminate information quickly and cheaply. But Corbett says, no, I'm seeing what I see in my world, and I'm painting it as an oil painting. And the reason I'm painting an oil painting is because the French Academy of Fine Arts considers oil painting to be the pinnacle of art, right? The most important type of art. And that's what I'm going to see my world. I'm going to paint it as an oil painting because to him, it was the most important thing. So he understood that a painting is in itself a reality, a two-dimensional world of stretched canvas defined by the nature and textural consistency of paint, and the artist's function is to define this world. So he's very insistent. He writes, he has a manifesto, he's very clear about what he's doing. All right, so let's talk about his very large, 22 feet long painting of the burial at Ornans. The burial at Ornans is, A Burial at Ornans is significant in the history of modern painting for its denial of illusionistic depth. So Corbett is not using all the tricks, all the bells and whistles, this, atmospheric perspective, linear perspective that has been known, back from Renaissance painting. This is what you were supposed to do. He's saying, no, stop, I'm doing something different. It's apparent lack of formal composition. So when you look at an academic painting, when you look at something that the French Royal Academy is going to show you, you expect to see a full story, a complete story. You know what's happening. You know who all the players are. You know that this is taken from history. We've seen this painting, before. We know what is there. And Corbett is saying, no, I'm not doing that. I'm taking something from, that's not how we live our real life. I'm taking something from real life. And you can think about how influential photography was, right? Because photography snaps a picture in the moment, right? It snaps everyday life. It's not always all perfect and set up. And so that's what Corbett, he's saying. And approached the subject matter so radical that it was seen as an insult for everything which the French Academy stood. And the French Royal Academy was the pinnacle. If you could show in their yearly salons, you were made as an artist. You were going to be able to pay your rent. You're going to be able to sell your paintings. And Corbett is saying no. And when they refused his paintings at the French Academy, he said, I'm making my own. I'm making my own gallery show. I'm building my own building and I'm showing it. And today we understand that, right? That's what artists do. If you want to have a show and you can't find a gallery, maybe you can rent a space for a night. You can do a pop-up event, right? But back then, Corbett is really one of the first to do this, and it's so radical at that time. His assertion of paint texture, the artist drew on and amplified the intervening experiments of the Romantics. The Romantics had been using textural paint, but he had a different mind, a different end in view. Whereas the Romantics used broken paint surface to emphasize the intangible elements of the spirit or sublime natural phenomena, Corbett says, yeah, no. Oh, we're not doing that, right? Corbett says, if you show me an angel, I'll paint an angel, right? I'm not painting these, imaginary mythological beings that I've never seen. No way. You produce an angel, then I'll make a painting of an angel. Corbett employed them as a means to make the ordinary world more tangible. So he really wanted to give you a sense that you're standing there with that group in the cemetery. So again, we see an artist using using composition and paint application to create controversial messages speaking against the Academy. And the burial documents a commonplace event in Corbett's small provincial hometown. So if the French Academy showed a painting of a burial, it would be a burial of somebody famous. We would know who it is. But this is a relative of Corbett's, and not to say they weren't important, but they weren't a celebrity. They weren't somebody famous. This was just his small hometown. But he's taking this, not every day, obviously the funeral was very important to the people that it was happening for, but it was just important in that town, right? It wasn't of national significance or anything like that. But he paints it on this scale that is what history painters would paint on. These huge canvases would be reserved for important events from the past, and Corbett says, no, I'm painting my family. I'm painting this moment. It's not even an important moment in the funeral. It's just a moment where people are standing around, and I'm making it big. I'm making it important. His casual frieze-like arrangement of village inhabitants, made up mostly of his friends and relatives, right? So again, this is something that's very personal to him. It's not important to everybody else who's seeing it, is an accurate depiction of local funerary customs. So men and women are segregated, they're standing separately, but it has no particular narrative message, right? This is just, it's almost like a photographer might have been there and just snapped a picture, right? So it was not only for this lack of compositional hierarchy and pictorial rhetoric that outraged French critics. Corbett's representation of ordinary residents of the countryside did not coincide with established Parisian norms for the depiction of rural folk. The way we wanted to see people in the academy, if you saw a painting that had peasants, the peasants would be happy, pretty people. And Corbett says, no, that's not real life. I'm painting people the way they look. These are not the ennobled peasants of Millet. So, and I don't want to diss Millet. Millet, he is very much he's very much speaking for the peasants as well, but this is again a different view than even his. These are not the pretty happy maids of traditional academic paintings. Rather, they are highly individualized, mostly unattractive, right? You look around, people look the way they look, and aggressively real. All right, and here it is again. And I had an amazing teacher in graduate school, and she said, think about how big this is. This is 22 feet long, and look what is right on the front here. This is the hole that's being dug, that has been dug for the coffin, right? So this is the burial spot. And if you saw this in a gallery, this 20-foot long painting right in front of you, it would almost be like you could fall right into that hole, right? So Corbett this is a very sort of graphic representation. And here you can see all the women who are mourning on this side. This would have been according to the traditions of the village. The men would have been on one side, the women would be on the other side. And he even has this dog, and usually in a painting, in the academy, the dog is going to stand for something like a rich person owns this kind of exotic dog or something, and that's not at all what this is. The dog is just there because the dog's owner came to the funeral, and the dog is just standing there. So everything about this, the way he's compressing space, the huge scale, and the fact that these are real people, you could, at his time, you could have picked out who these people were, all make this just a very, very inflammatory. It's so exciting to think about, how transgressive this painting was at the time. All right, so combined with his unorthodox approach to formal matters, Corbett's realism in his unpolished treatment of working class subjects was associated with left-wing dissidents. Realism and Corbett's sharpened political sensibilities came to the fore during these decades of political turmoil, when Republicans, Bonapartists, Royalists, and Socialists struggled to realign France's government. So everybody, they're all fighting and trying to get a government that's going to satisfy, whoever ends up in power. Corbett pursued his political sympathies on his canvases as he did in life, causing much uproar with his realist paintings as with his activism. His contempt for the conservatism of official arts institutions spurred him in 1855 to mount a grand exhibition of his works, some of which had been rejected by the Salon jury, in a temporary pavilion of realism. So they had these huge universal exhibitions, these fairs where thousands and thousands of people came to see painting and many other things, technology. And so he built this actual pavilion of realism. He built his own building right adjacent, right? So if you came to the Universal Exposition, you could also go and see this hall of Corbett's work, because his work didn't get accepted to the Salon. So that meant for most people that they couldn't be seen, but Corbett says, no, I'm building my own place. You come and see my work. The gesture encouraged later avant-garde artists like the Impressionists. So this is really, we'll hear about the Salon des Refusés, which means the refused salon, the salon where anybody whose work wasn't accepted by the official salon could come and show. The Impressionists used this to great advantage for their work. And this all started with this idea that Corbett had. And by the end of the century, the salon would be displaced entirely. People still went to the salons, but that was people who wanted to see the established kind of art, right? The very conservative kind of art, but not this groundbreaking new art that's going to come. The Impressionists, the Expressionists, all that. All right, and I'm going to just spend a little bit of time. This is another image that he painted called The Source of the Lou, and this is the source of this river. But again, you can see that it's very photographic in the way that he's cropping the subject matter, so you can see that his brand of realism really changed the expectations for paintings. For the ardent socialist, Corbett, peasant laborers and the rural landscape were the true sources of French identity and hence political authority. In a group of landscapes from the 1850s and 60s, the source of the blue among them, Corbett had experimented with a form of extreme close-ups of rocks abruptly cut off at the edge of the painting. So again, you can see how much inspired by photography he was. A view from the artist's native province of Franche-Comté, the source may owe something to the emerging art of photography, both in its fragmentary impression and its subdued, almost monochromatic color. Remember, at this point in time, photographs were only black and white. Courbet's landscape, however, combined a sense of observed reality. So that's really important to Courbet. Go out there and see it. See, paint based on what you see. Don't make up some kind of scene from ancient Greece, right? Go out, look at the world, paint that. With an even greater sense of the elements and materials with which the artists were working. So the rectangle of the picture plane, an emphatic texture of the oil paint. You can see, the paint is very rough, which asserted its own nature at the same time that it was simulating the rough-hewn sculptural appearance of these rocks. All right, and so we're going to move on to our last realist artist. Again, a very different kind of artist, Rosa Bonor, painting the natural world, painting animals, known as an animal painter. And she lived from 1822 to 1899. Like Courbet, the realist painter Rosa Bonor addressed largely rural themes, endowing her subjects with a grandeur akin to that of Millet's peasants. She nevertheless departs from her Barbizon contemporaries, so other landscape painters. She departs from them in her depictions of landscapes of crystalline clarity and rich color. And when it reopens, there is an amazing painting of an eagle, a wounded eagle, in the collection of LACMA from Rosa Bonor. Thanks to the progressive views of her parents, Bonor was allowed to study painting and even permitted to visit farms and slaughterhouses disguised as a boy. Because remember, at this point, women were not allowed to paint from the nude still. So she could sketch and acquire some knowledge of anatomy. The accuracy and sympathy of her paintings of animals in particular earned her fame as well as fortune. And she was famous for not liking men. She's had a quote, which I'm not going to get right, but something about the only men she liked were the bulls that she painted. Plowing in the Nivernais exemplifies her approach to realism in its respect for agricultural labor, its careful observation of livestock. She was out there every day, looking at animals, sketching them, and its glowing precision. And we're gonna play this short video. If you're looking at this as a PDF, well, you can find the PDF and click on it, but I'm also going to play the video to round out this segment on realism.
We're in the Musée d'Orsay, and we're looking at Rosa Bonor's light-filled painting called Plowing Nivernais.
That refers to both a region and the kind of oxen that are the stars of this canvas.
They are. The human figure that pushes them along is hardly important.
So Rosa Bonor did some extraordinary things. She was an incredibly precocious girl. I think it was at age 14 she was actually sketching in the Louvre and actually creating oil paintings. This was possible because her father was an artist and had really encouraged her. I think they were very liberal.
Otherwise, she really would not have had her enormous artistic talent encouraged. She might not have ended up a painter at all.
So this was made in 1849, which is just 1 year after the Revolution. And it's so interesting that an artist now is moving out into the countryside, away from all of the chaos of the city.
Where the Revolution happened.
I mean, we have this incredible image of these oxen turning the soil in the fall to prepare it for the following year's season. And look at the soil itself. You almost get a sense that here is the strength of France.
The earth looks incredibly rich and fertile. So there is a sense of a kind of nationalistic idea of the French countryside and that France will survive and indeed thrive.
And those oxen are so powerful and so beautiful and, in a sense, so eternal. This is a ritual that has gone on long before the politics of the modern world.
And will continue long after. They come forward in a receding diagonal that moves into our space. So we have this sense of depth and atmospheric perspective and sense of weather and the warmth of the sunlight. It's really, so particularly and carefully observed. And it reminds me of so much that we see in the 1840s and then into the 1850s of this interest in rural life, of laborers, of the virtues of the countryside.
When I look at this, the oxen, those backs are so beautifully aligned, they almost create their own horizon, like the hills beside them. And so, in a sense, they are the earth itself. There is this sense of permanence. I think throughout the 1840s, especially with the kind of industrialization and the growth of the cities that's taking place, there is this real desire to return to this much more basic truth.
Which resides in nature and the countryside.
And in labor itself,
Yeah.
but a kind of simple, very direct kind of labor.
So do you think Rosa Bonor is giving us a conservative vision at this moment, just after a very radical revolution of 1848 that brings the working class into power in a significant way?
I think that there are conservative aspects here, but it's more complicated than that. She's breaking too many boundaries. She is emphasizing the importance of landscape, of animal painting itself, on a scale that is often reserved for history painting. She is a woman not painting in interiors, not painting as an amateur, but is painting at the level of the highest professional. These are radical ideas, and I don't think we can see this as conservative painting.
And really remarkable accomplishments.
All right, and so there's our end of part one. I just want to encourage you to, in the optional resources, there are another couple of videos on Rosa Bonor. She was such an amazing figure. She became incredibly famous, very wealthy. She bought her own estate, and she really ran it like a male painter. She had a female partner. They lived together for 40 years, and she had to even write to the French government to get permission to wear pants. She would go to these, horse shows, and all the men would harass her, and finally she wrote to the government and asked them for permission to wear pants and kind of dressed up as a man, so that she could just sit and do her drawing. And amazing drawing from nature, very singular purpose as an artist, and just an amazing woman. So I encourage you to watch those videos about her. And again, we've come to the end of part one. Thanks for your attention.